author, among other things, of Enemies Within, and a documentary film, a feature-length documentary film of the same name. He has been just an incredibly important resource to our Committee on the Present Danger China, of which he is a founding member, and to the work of our organization, the Center for Security Policy, and so many others in terms of understanding the challenge that we're facing from, well, Marxists, social democrats, socialists, communists, and the like that are operating here. And Trevor, we talked before the break about the dedication by the Chinese Communist Party of an immense amount of resources and personnel to something called the United Front Work Department. And I had to interrupt you as you were describing its manifestations. I'd like you to continue that thought, and specifically, how do the various United Front operatives work inside a country like the United States towards their agenda of taking down this country?
Well, not long ago, John Ratcliffe, Trump's intelligence chief, publicly said that the Chinese Communist Party has bribed or corrupted so many US politicians it can determine which legislation is passed through the US Congress. Now, that should terrify every American. And that was news for about a few hours, and it sort of disappeared from the news cycle. But the Chinese Communist Party has multiple organizations operating on American soil, the Confucius Institutes in the universities, the grassroots groups like the Chinese Progressive Association in San Francisco, New York, and Boston, and large groups like the Committee of 100, which was actually started by Henry Kissinger back in the 90s. And has
Why
been
am I
used...
not surprised?
No, you wouldn't be surprised, would you? You know, but that group in particular is targeting high, very influential Americans, not just of Chinese extraction, but it is many leading politicians are connected to that group, including Adam Schiff, the Democrat head of the Intelligence Committee, Dianne Feinstein, who has served on the Senate Intelligence Committee.
Chaired it for a number of years.
Yeah, for many years. And Judy Chu from California, who's head of the Asia Pacific Caucus in the US Congress and a prominent member of the Progressive Caucus. So these are key American politicians involved in a massive Chinese front operation. And so there are multiple ways that the Chinese tend to work with the Democrats on ideological lines. They tend to use business to co-opt Republicans, but they have massive influence in the Congress and the Senate. And just by the way, the new head of the Committee of 100 is Gary Locke, who was Obama's former governor of Washington State and Obama's ambassador to China. But he is now the leader of this massive Chinese Communist Front operating on US soil.
Now you've talked about a number of prominent Democrats in the House of Representatives that came out of basically, I guess, the San Francisco machine for the Democratic Party, and all have in common this connection to China. You could add Eric Swalwell, a member of Congress, who has apparently literally been sleeping with the enemy, a Chinese communist agent, espionage agent specifically, and not least Nancy Pelosi, who thinks so highly of him despite this disgrace, despite this, well, national security peril that he represents, not only to keep him on the Intelligence Committee, but to make him one of the designated prosecutors for the case against President Trump in his second impeachment trial. Trevor, you mentioned that these and other figures are tied into the Chinese Communist Party's presence and infrastructure in San Francisco, um, are they wittingly working with not just various front groups, but with the CCP, do you think? Or is there a possible innocent explanation, even after all these exposures of what they've been doing and with whom?
Well, I think the three key operatives in the Bay Area are probably Dianne Feinstein, former Mayor of San Francisco Willie Brown, and Nancy Pelosi. And all of them have had a long time connection with the American Communist Party, going right back into the 1950s and early 1960s. And and then they have moved, as the Soviet Union sort of faded away, all three of them moved more and more into the Chinese orbit. Now, it beggars belief to believe they don't know what they're doing or don't have some understanding. The fact that a man like Swalwell, serving on the Intelligence Committee, is sleeping with a Chinese agent, but Nancy Pelosi refuses to remove him from the most sensitive committee in the US Congress, tells me that Nancy Pelosi has a bit of an idea of what she's doing. Um, and the other one, Willie Brown, was the lover of Kamala Harris, who is now going to effectively be the president of the United States. And Dianne Feinstein worked for years to open Chinese access to American markets, to get them admitted to the World Trade Organization. She built the Chinese Communist Party from San Francisco, from her San Francisco base. And
Wow.
that's
So,
why she's
and
been
she
made a
also,
lot of money trading with them. So,
yeah, she also had for 2 decades a Chinese spy as not just her driver, as he's often described, but as her office manager out in California, which is a position from which he had access, obviously, to immense amounts of information, not only about her and access to her, obviously, but about her, activities and policy decisions, I assume. So, Trevor, when you put all this together, and you mentioned Kamala Harris and her prospective role as the de facto president of the United States. She may well, for all we know, soon be the actual president of the United States. Um, what can you tell us about her involvement with this machinery of the Democratic Party on the one hand, yes, but also its deep ties apparently in the San Francisco Bay Area, especially to the Chinese Communist Party.
well, look, her whole life has been spent in and around pro-Chinese communists, stretching right back from her parents. Her father, Don Harris, a Jamaican economist, her mother, Shyamala Gopalan, an Indian cancer researcher. They were active Marxist radicals back in the 60s. Her father was an affirmative action Marxist professor at Stanford University. But she was involved with Willie Brown, who was very heavily involved with the American Communist Party, then the Chinese Communist Party, well after his affair with her. Her husband, Doug Emhoff's law firm is very heavily involved with Communist China, had Chinese Communist Party members on its staff. But she is really promoted by a man called Steve Phillips, a lawyer from the San Francisco Bay Area, a former member of the League of Revolutionary Struggle, a pro-Chinese Communist Party. He was a student radical at Stanford with Maya Harris, Kamala's sister. They were very close. The whole family and Steve Phillips were very close. But Steve Phillips and here married into a whole bunch of money, the Sandler family fortune, and he has used that um, to gain huge influence in the Democratic Party. And he basically got Kamala elected to the DA's position in San Francisco, Attorney General from California, US Senate from California, and now the White House. And that man is still actively financing pro-Chinese communist groups in the Bay Area and nationwide. So
Can you give us some
yes,
examples of those
the
groups
Chinese.
to be specific, Trevor?
What was that? Sorry, Frank.
Can you give us some examples of such groups that this patron of Kamala Harris has been sponsoring, Chinese Communist Party associated groups in the Bay Area?
Well, in the Bay Area, what he sponsors a new Virginia Majority, which is a pro-Chinese communist group that has helped to flip Virginia. But he also sponsors, he helped to set up a group called Left Roots. He financed the beginnings of that group, and that group is very heavily involved, is really part of Liberation Road, the pro-Chinese Communist Party in America, but it's also it runs the Chinese Progressive Association in San Francisco, which is the sort of the support group, the pro-communist Chinese support group for Black Lives Matter. And so Steve Phillips set up this group, Left Roots, which runs the Chinese Progressive Association, which for 40 years has been Communist China's main influence operation in the San Francisco Bay Area. So this is the man who gave you Kamala Harris, but is also heavily involved in promoting pro-Chinese communist activity in the Bay Area and further afield.
Trevor, we have to take another break momentarily. I just want to say when we come back, we're going to talk a little bit about two of those groups that you've just mentioned, Liberation Road and the Chinese Progressive Association, and their ties to one or both of the groups that have been most, well, aggressively pursuing revolution in our country, notably in the form of true insurrection in our streets, true mob violence across the country, namely Liberation Road and the Chinese Progressive Association. We'll talk about that and a lot more involving how the Chinese Communist Party has gotten its hooks into our country and what it means when Trevor Loudon says senior and influential, in fact, top American officials are involved with such groups and with the Chinese Communist Party itself. All of that and much more with Trevor Loudon, the author of Enemies Within, among others, and a film of that name, which I commend to you as well. We'll be right back with more Tool Straight Ahead. Our third segment with Trevor Loudon. Trevor is a remarkable resource, one of our best imports from New Zealand, I think it's fair to say. He often describes himself as having a Southern accent, which is quite discernible. But what he says is of great significance, and we always appreciate his visiting with us here at Secure Freedom Radio. And Trevor, thank you for going the extra mile and doing this on video as well as audio. You can follow all of this at securingamerica.tv. Let me ask you, Trevor, to pick up on points that we touched on at the end of that last segment, specifically the extent to which groups like Liberation Road and the Chinese Progressive Association, prominent communist operations tied into this United Front work department of the Chinese Communist Party, have been deeply involved with two particularly insidious organizations that came to great notoriety in the past 6 or 7 months, namely Antifa and Black Lives Matter.
Well, the Chinese Progressive Association, as I said, has been around since the 1970s. It was founded by members of the League of Revolutionary Struggle, which Steve Phillips, who I mentioned before, was involved with. That morphed eventually into what they called the Freedom Road Socialist Organization, and that became Liberation Road and Left Roots. So that organization is run by those people. I have on tape one of its leaders, Alex Tom, talking about his how the Chinese Progressive Association has a long-term relationship with the Chinese Communist Party, that they run their messaging past them, their positioning past them, and they have regular conversations with the Chinese Communist Party. He's also led delegations to Communist China to meet with party members and and certain institutions in China. So this group, the Chinese Progressive Association, is really the guiding body of Black Lives Matter. The three women who started Black Lives Matter, Opal Tometi, Alicia Garza, and Patrisse Cullors, are all affiliated with Liberation Road. Now, Alicia Garza in particular, the main founder of Black Lives Matter, is a long-time personal friend of Alex Tom. They've been radicals together since their student days at UC San Diego in the early 90s. She is involved with the Chinese Progressive Association. She served on some of their committees, for instance, and she is guided, I believe, by the Chinese Progressive Association through a group that Alex Tom and others set up called Asians for Black Lives. Now, Asians for Black Lives is a complete creation of the Chinese Progressive Association. They wrote the revolutionary manual that guides Black Lives Matter, and they fund Alicia Garza, and they have introduced Alicia Garza to their networks of pro-Chinese communists around the country. So there's very clear indications that Black Lives Matter is a Chinese operation. That extends to the Chinese links to the Ferguson riots of 2014 and the ongoing Liberation Road links to Black Lives Matter all over the country. Black Lives Matter is a Liberation Road front. Liberation Road is a Chinese operation.
This is fascinating, Trevor. And when you say involved, obviously people have different levels of association, but it sounds as though what you're describing is a pretty readily documentable degree of engagement on the part of these Americans, including elected officials, with elements of the Chinese Communist Party's extensive influence campaigns and infrastructure in our country. And again, I take it you're prepared to argue that this is knowing, witting, deliberate engagement, not just that they're being somehow innocently exploited or taken advantage of by skillful influence operators. Is that fair?
Well, look, Kamala Harris, for instance, she mentored a young woman called Latifah Simon. She sort of picked her up pretty from the radical set and got her through college. And now Latifah Simon serves on the Bay Area Rapid Transit Board and is the head of the Akinadi Foundation, a radical left-wing foundation in San Francisco. Well, Latifah Simon was very closely associated with standing together to organize a revolutionary movement, Storm. She served with Van Jones, who became Obama's Green Jobs czar, now serves on CNN. Latifah Simon, the other members of that board became members of Left Roots, and Latifah Simon is best friends with Alicia Garza, the founder of Black Lives Matter. So Kamala Harris, Latifah Simon, and Alicia Garza form a little set, and Kamala Harris has openly come out in favor of Black Lives Matter and openly talked about how the rioting and protest should go on well after the election. So someone with Kamala Harris's family communist background deliberately promoting Maoist communists in the Bay Area and aligning herself with a pro-Chinese communist movement, Black Lives Matter, tends to show that she knows what she's doing.
Yeah. I want to talk with you about other manifestations of the Chinese penetration of our society, our economy, our body politics. But the elephant in the room, I guess, that hasn't been mentioned to this point, and we need to address very directly, I think, is Joe Biden and his ties to the Chinese Communist Party, Trevor Loudon, um, we learned a lot about them through revelations from Hunter Biden, his son, and the laptop that turned up in the latter days of the election for president of 2020. What do we know about Joe Biden through that source, among others, and his attitude towards and, well, his own engagement with the Chinese Communist Party over the years?
Well, Joe Biden has been deeply compromised by through his son, and the Chinese have a program. They sometimes when they try to influence a foreign politician, they don't directly go after the politician per se. They go after the princes, the princelings, the sons or nephews or relatives
Brothers. Mm-hmm.
or brothers of the target. So they have certainly targeted Hunter Biden. They've also targeted Joe Biden's brother. And we learned through the computers that Joe Biden was very, very aware of his son's business involvement with the Chinese, which has rewarded the son with many, many millions of dollars for doing very little, real.
Yeah.
Like he doesn't have a lot of expertise in any great field. So he was clearly targeted because of his involvement, his relationship to Joe Biden, and for no other reason.
Mm-hmm.
So, but
There's
Joe
there's
Biden,
actually evidence of Joe Biden himself actually profiting from some of
yeah,
these ties, according to that laptop. Is that right?
yes, there is. He was involved with skimming off some of the profits. I think it was 10% on one business arrangement. Joe Biden's ties with the Chinese. If he was applying for a job in the Department of Agriculture, and his background was checked out, there's no way he would get a security clearance,
Right.
none whatsoever.
Yeah.
But
And here
it
it's
shows
about to become the commander in chief of
yeah,
the United States. And Trevor, to the extent that this has been established, uh, is there any doubt in your mind that these sorts of relationships, compromising relationships, I think you've accurately described them, would be exploited by the Chinese Communist Party?
are you kidding? The Chinese have got compromising material on the most powerful man in the world, the commander in chief of the U.S. military, their main opposition to conquest of the planet. And just by the way, Joe Biden's career goes back to the 1970s when he was promoted by a group called the Council for a Livable World.
Yes.
And that organization's goal was to gut the US military to the advantage of the Soviet Union. Now, Joe fitted right into that the man who created the Council for a Livable World was a bona fide Soviet agent called Leo Szilard, and Joe Biden was personally recruited by a man called Al Gore Sr. Some of you may have heard of his son. He invented the internet and global warming.
Yes.
And Al Gore Sr. was a protege of a man called Armand Hammer, the leading American Soviet agent of the early 20th century. So Joe Biden has worked in the interests of Moscow and Tehran and more latterly Beijing his entire political career. And we think the Chinese won't try and exploit that.
No, it doesn't sound credible that they'd miss a trick like this, especially given what we know of Chinese tradecraft. They are brilliant, patient, strategic, disciplined in not only creating these kinds of opportunities for exploitation, but actually engaging in it. Um, Trevor, when we come back, I've promised that we're going to talk more about the penetration of our country by the Chinese Communist Party. I want to both get you to tease that out for us and talk about what we must do about all of this under a Biden-Harris administration. That and more with Trevor Loudon straight ahead.